Into what it means and the sharpest opinion. There's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan, and in for Amy J this morning is John Cass, former Tribune columnist. Now you find his work at johncassnews.com. Also, podcasters, the Chicago Way podcast. Law firm taking legal action on behalf of Minnesotans opposed to critical race theory, who argue they become victims of retaliation for speaking out against what they say is divisive and discriminatory curriculum and philosophy. The Minnesota-based Upper Midwest Law Center announced on July 30th it had filed complaints and lawsuits on behalf of clients who seek to end the propagandizing of CRT and the retaliation that accompanies it, to inculcate it. This will continue to be a fight here as schools open in some form or fashion, or at least some of them do, in just weeks, and it should be a fight. It should be a fight.
Are people going to fight, or are they just going to bail?
Well, some people are fighting.
I mean, just bail.
No,
I'm not going to go through it. I'm just going to go Indiana, Wisconsin, somewhere, and so my kids don't have to go through this again.
Yeah, but the problem is you cannot run it. I mean, there's going to be very few places where you cannot run it. At some point, you're going to be compelled to stand and fight or to genuflect. I mean, it's just how ubiquitous it is now, and not just K through 12, but also obviously in corporate America too.
So when does corporate America and corporate media characterize those parents who are standing and fighting as Nazis or mass murderers on a scale of?
Well, here again, I mean, that people think they're alone, and I don't have time to organize parents and so on and so forth. Well, you have this outlet or outfits like this this Upper Midwest Law Center, public interest law firm in Minnesota. You've got other public interest law firms like No Left Turn. You've seen the organizing everywhere from South Lake, Texas, to Loudoun County, Virginia. So. Actually, to California as well. We've talked to parents all over the country. So it is happening. The question is, will the pushback be equal to the force of the rapacious CRTers? I don't know. They, as you mentioned, John, they certainly have a lot of support in the media, and this has been going on for a long time. You know, we're always late to these fights, people who believe in free minds and a free society. Always late to these fights. As was pointed out by Professor Eric Kaufman from Birkbeck College at the University of London in a recent piece, citing the work of Zach Goldberg, who's a Georgia State University academic. You know, the use of the term racism and similar terms started to take off around 2015. The identitarians, the neo-Marxists, started to claim the language, I mean, well before then, but it really started to spike. This is, half a decade ago. And where have people been? Now they're just getting hip to what's going on because it's manifesting itself in the schools, as it inevitably will. Control the schools, you control the future. What caused this spike? Again, citing this piece from Kaufman. Social media and the new partisan clickbait business model and online journalism as the catalysts. Yeah, I mean, right. Something that's sensationalized is more opportunity to get eyeballs, and narrowcasting, right? But it's also it's a reflection of the ideology of newsrooms. We know 84 to 92%, based on Gallup polling over the last 50 years, 84 to 92% of members of the so-called DC Press Corps have voted for the Democrat candidate for president during that time. It's
an excellent piece by Professor Kaufman, and I can't wait to hear what he has to say about George Soros and my situation, with Kim Fox, $2 million.
Well, let's get right to it then. Professor Eric Kaufman, professor of politics, Birkbeck College, University of London, also the author of White Shift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. Professor Kaufman, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Great to be here, Dan.
So again, a little bit of, the run-up to where we are now. Let's talk about where we are now a little bit. Some survey research that's included in this piece you wrote over at unheard.com. Survey research you did about white and black Republican and Democrats' understanding of of race in America. I thought that some of these issues, like the likelihood of dying at the hands of police and who understands what the real data suggests, was very interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, part of this is just to see whether people could get basic facts right. So for example, what is the risk of a young black man dying from a police bullet versus dying in a car accident? And we have hard data on that's just a fact, that it's about a sort of 6 to 10 times more likely for such a person to die in a car accident than from a police bullet. And so if you look, however, at who gets that question wrong, something on the order of 8 in 10 African-American Democrat voters get that wrong. 9 in 10, because 1 in 10 are unsure. Only 1 in 10 get it right. Amongst white liberals who think white Republicans are racist, something like 7 in 10 are getting that question wrong as well. Whereas amongst, say, if you take white Trump voters, only about 15% get it wrong. So it's skewing people's perception. And this is coming out of that media, what I call the social construction of racism, which is due to that media narrative, which Goldberg tracks very nicely. The use of the term racism just spikes after about 2015 in major progressive news outlets like the New York Times and Washington Post. Actually, what you can see is the Times and the Post and the progressive outlets actually picked this up around 2014-15. Then you can see the LA Times and other outlets coming in on sort of 2015-16, and then eventually other news outlets. So yeah, it's definitely a line of influence coming from those elite progressive news outlets.
And is that because they are so many in the media are on the left, that confirmation bias, or whatever that is, where you measure something and then therefore change it in social sciences, that they're predisposed to see the reality that they want to see? And I'm just reading your line here in your piece. One reason for this was the media's desire to tap into the mythic script of a white officer killing a black suspect.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, that is a sort of sacred identity for a lot of cultural leftists who are heavily overrepresented in the mainstream progressive news outlets like New York Times. So they're going to be very receptive to any storyline, as is, by the way, for example, the President of the United States, who sort of leaned into these statistically misleading stereotypes about the risks of being shot by police, which are like being struck by lightning, essentially, for black individuals who are unarmed, claiming, during the Chauvin trial and afterwards, that reinforcing these complete myths about you're at risk of being shot if you walk outside your home and you're black. So it's as if the president were to say to people, you're at risk of dying from the COVID vaccine. Like it's essentially like leading into vaccine skepticism. Exactly the same thing, but in this case, it's seen as okay because that's a narrative that people believe in.
So with respect to getting them, it'd be great to get a survey of the DC press corps too and see how many of them would get those questions right. I'm sure they won't submit to such a survey. But here's the thing too, and we've talked about this before. The other aspect you just mentioned a key word too. Part of their identity. This is a sacred construct. The white police officer shooting the black suspect.
Right.
And so as race relations have improved over the last 50 years, now there is the demand for more instances of racism because we have to keep this going. So they will create the supply to meet their demand to promote their identity and essentially the agenda underneath that identity. Is that conspiracy theorizing, or is that reflective of what's actually going on?
Well, there is obviously there are a lot of racial hoaxes, racist hate crime hoaxes, which have expanded greatly in recent years. I think Wilfred Riley has a book on that.
Right.
But what I think we have here is simply the inflation of any one incident. So Zach Goldberg also showed that any police shooting or police killings of African Americans had 9 times the coverage of every police killing of white Americans, of which there are many more than of black Americans, at least twice as many. And so what it is sort of a magnification of the few instances that exist to create this false impression that there is this epidemic. And yeah, that is a sort of moral panic that's being created and constructed. Of course, it's fed to some degree by citizen journalism and by the clickbait media model, and all of these sorts of things are contributing factors. But of course, it falls on ideologically receptive soil too.
Yeah, right, exactly. But I mean, it's more than it's receptive. They're not passive, and I don't think they're willfully blind. I mean, you can't ignore the Tony Timpa case in Dallas, and without saying, that does not, formally saying it, at least in your mind, this does not fit. This undermines what we're trying to do. We're going to ignore it.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the fascinating thing is we had video of exactly a carbon copy of the Floyd case, even more egregious because the officers were joking about it, and nothing, right? So that kind of tells you all you need to know about the fact, because it didn't fit the script, it was more or less ignored. And so and likewise, if it's black on black, it's also going to be ignored. So it's got to be a very specific configuration, white on black, that is going to be picked up in the media. And what's interesting, you can look at the opinion survey data that Goldberg tracked, and you can see that it's really only, for the most part, Democratic opinion that really changes. Between 2014 and 2021, the number saying racism is a big problem kind of jumps from 40 to over 80%, whereas it's pretty flat for Republican voters, and it's sort of in between for independents. So it just shows you kind of who is receptive to this new framing, partly because of the media they consume.
Speaking of media, I have a personal interest in a few of the paragraphs in your piece. You referenced the story about billionaire George Soros donating $1 million to racial injustice organization seeking to defund the police. And liberal billionaire Soros donated $33 million to social justice organizations, which in turn, which helped turn events in Ferguson from a local protest to a national flashpoint. In the context of what you're talking about, where does Soros fit in all this? Is he fairly being discussed, or is he being perceived as a totem?
Well, I'm not hugely informed on exactly what I know he's given to these movements which have advocated for defund, which is ultimately responsible for the huge spike in murders and blight and minority businesses.
Exactly.
So it's got a huge. If you're going to be cynical about it, you could actually call the events, post mid-2020 as systemic racism, actually, because who is it going to hit hardest, right? But anyway, I won't go there. What I would say is, I think this is it's actually bigger than Soros. I mean, this is the mainstream papers taking editorial decisions, influenced ultimately from the universities. If you look at the post-2015, what's happened on campus, the mobbing of Nicholas Christakis at Yale,
yes.
The sort of cancel culture. Now, that is sort of an eruption that begins in the elite universities, but whose intellectual origins really go back to even the 60s and 70s with critical race theory, and that just sort of gestated for a while, and then suddenly explodes in 2015, and then it sort of spreads into these elite media institutions, and from there, of course, into corporations and elsewhere. So yeah, I do think this thing has a sort of intellectual origin on campus, and then it's just the graduates going into these newsrooms, going into foundations, publishing houses, Hollywood, etc., and spreading these ideas.
He is Eric Kaufman, professor of politics, Birkbeck College, University of London, and author of White Shift, Populism, Immigration, and the Future of White Majorities. Eric, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Dan.
Hey, join us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
If you're talking about it, Dan and Amy are talking about it. It's Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
The Lou Dobbs Financial Report is brought to you by Signature Bank, helping local